Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. Ukraine War Frontline update for the 16th of January 2024. Before we go to look at the front line, let's pop into a piece from Bloomberg talking about what Jake Sullivan is apparently going to be delivering to Zelensky at the Davos meeting. This is from Andreas Kluth, the economist at Bloomberg. He says that Zelensky, according to the author, continues to deny the military stalemate to maintain morale in Ukraine. There's this big question. I've talked about this a lot before. Is there really a stalemate going on? So in terms of troops on the ground butting their heads against each other, you could argue that's a stalemate because people aren't moving. But actually, there's attrition levels that are different for both sides. And that does not suggest a stalemate. But then you look up in the air and you see the loss of the Russian planes over the last few days, the last few weeks, the last few months. And you think, well, that's not a stalemate. You see the Black Sea Fleet moving from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk, and you think that's not a stalemate. So it depends how you interpret the term stalemate, and depends in which context you're talking about. So, I think Zelensky has a right to deny that there is a stalemate going on. In fact, a number of analysts have done so. Davos meeting aimed at rallying countries around Zelensky's peace formula is considered a stalemate because Russia and China were not invited. After the failure of the counteroffensive and significant losses of the Ukrainian armed forces, an offensive becomes impossible. I think an offensive is impossible for the next, at least 6 months plus. Russia will focus on containing the captured territories until the US presidential election, hoping for the return of Donald Trump. I think this is definitely the case. I think that's exactly what Putin wants. The author believes that the West has already betrayed Kyiv, and Zelensky should demand increased supplies of weapons to go on the defense. I agree with that as well. I think that we aren't doing enough, and I think there are some realizations now that we haven't done enough, and so you're seeing Germany step up, you're seeing other nations take this really seriously within Europe, and you see a political desire from many areas of the American political scene, but there's such a bipartisan divide now going on. Ukraine, sadly, and I was speaking, Brian Ivey put a comment on my thread earlier to say, it really, and he's saying this as a Republican, a staunch Republican, leaning person, that it has become a bipartisan issue, that when he's defending Ukraine and aid to Ukraine, is getting attacked by fellow kind of Republicans on forums that he visits. And that's a really good indicator that this has become a bipartisan issue. And how sad is that? How terribly sad that something so important, so universally morally clear, is becoming a bipartisan issue. It's so upsetting for me that. But anyway, elements of that I think are true in what this source says. Elements I think are problematic. But I think, there are certain areas of Europe that are waking up to this being the existential threat that it genuinely is. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please pause the video and let's otherwise go to the front line. I'm not going to dip into the ISW, but otherwise you can assume that there is lots of activity going along in these various places along the front line. We're going to go to Makiivka first, which is just to the west of Ploshchanka here, by the highway that comes down, P66, R66 highway that comes down through Svatova, or from Svatova to Crimea. And the Russians are pushing in that direction, have been pushing in that direction. No changes to my mappers. No reports says north of Crimea, Russian forces have made advances towards Makiivka and the fields east of it. Part of these advances are reassessments of previous gains that had not been reported on previously. Russia has stepped up its offensive activities in the area. I don't think that signifies a change to the mapping I have. As you can see here, Andrew Perpetua and Surat Maps have some agreement, some disagreement around here, but broadly speaking, the Russians are fairly close to Makiivka from Surat Maps. Well, really from Andrew Perpetua's most western point, that is just 1.4 kilometers, right? So not far at all, which looks to be about what is claimed here, give or take. I mean, different shapes going on there, but the Russians are pushing in that area. And then we come further to the south, and we come to this area. Actually, thank you, JR, who did the mapping. This change has come in just subsequent to his mapping. Just a quick one from Surat Maps to show that the Russians have made some advances in the Serebryensky forest, which is a little bit challenging for the Ukrainians if it is indeed true. I can't quite work out what he says against these blue arrows, which show that the Ukrainians are pushing back in that area. But he says Russian army made small advances in the forest southwest of Crimea as troops are trying to expel the Ukrainian army from the southern positions. In addition, minimal advance was made on the northern outskirts of Bilohorivka. Oh, I missed that one, actually. That'll be one for tomorrow. So it doesn't say it, but it appears that the Ukrainians are trying to, obviously stop the Russians from advancing there, and some a tiny bit of advance maybe around Bilohorivka. Oh, actually, no, it does look like he might have that in there. Yep, so small advances there. So it looks like these changes were made quite late on for Surat Maps. Right, we can see also that Andrew Perpetua showing some gains there for the Russians, slightly more substantial gains there compared to the very small ones that Surat Maps is intimating. But yeah, the Ukrainians under a little bit of pressure around Bilohorivka, it seems. But as I've talked to you before, as I've mentioned before, this area is very difficult really for either side to make huge gains, because the topography is very much in favor of stasis, really. So you've got all this low ground in the middle, you've got a quarry by the looks of it, you've got Bilohorivka there, which is sort of flattened, and then you have considerably higher ground to the west, and actually some high ground to the east. But as you go further on, there is higher ground still. That's where the Russians have purchased there. They're controlling that area, and generally it's quite difficult for either side to make huge gains in this area. The Russians have pushed up to here, to near Bilohorivka, and then been pushed back, but the topography doesn't really favour any of the sides in particular. It's difficult for both sides to make any gains around Bilohorivka without putting in an awful lot of effort and resources. Nonetheless, some small gains there for the Russians. Then we come on down to the Bakhmut area. As you can see, no changes to the mapping there, although no reports does say that in the Bakhmut-Bodanivka area, Russians have advanced along the whole eastern part of Bodanivka, entering the settlement and controlling roughly 20 to 30% of it. The centre remains contested. In the last 24 hours, the Ukrainians repelled a fairly big Russian mechanized attack in that area. So as we come to Bodanivka, that's pretty much in line with what, say, Surat Maps has, which is a sort of 30%, maybe Andrew Perpetua's 20%. So somewhere around that is what no reports are saying. And a large attack has been repelled in the last 24 hours, was repelled by the Ukrainians there. But other than that, there are no changes. Well, including that, there are no changes to my mapping sources there in the Bakhmut area. So we come on down to Avdiivka here. You can see no changes to the main mappers in the Avdiivka area, that cauldron around Avdiivka. Getty, however, does say that the Ukrainian Defense Forces returned their positions to the northeast of the line. This appears to be the idea that the Ukrainians have made some gains. I wonder exactly where that would be. Actually, that looks like it's down in the industrial zone area, just here. And that, as you can see, there's a sort of water treatment or some kind of filtration facility there, something like that. I'm not 100% sure. There, that just to the west of there, some gains for the Ukrainians. So somewhere around here, possibly some Ukrainian gains, but not reflected in the mappers I use as sources, but that is at least what Getty is claiming there. So perhaps some gains for the Ukrainians there. Otherwise, no change. And as I keep saying, no change is good for the Ukrainians at this point in the war, where the Russians appear to be sort of gathering themselves for another attack or have been attacking Avdiivka. Obviously, they've been attacking since October, the beginning of October. Absolutely brutal around there. Ukrainians have lost a lot. Russians have lost a huge amount. But of course, as I mentioned in the live stream today, and you can get a pretty depressive look at the war to say, if nothing big comes in way of aid, if there isn't some kind of game-changing aid that the Ukrainians can take on board, then it might be attritional to the point that the Russians will prevail. And by prevail, I don't mean win. Actually, I don't think the Russians can win. They certainly can't maximally take Ukraine. But what they can do is force Ukraine to the negotiating table with pressure from international partners. And that will be hastened if Russia can continue sending in their mobilized troops. They have that advantage in personnel and equipment, and they appear to be not so worried about their own losses because they're trying to force Ukraine into a negotiating position without any care for their own human lives. So they have that advantage. So, the Ukrainians need to keep that attritional level up to overcome that personal advantage. As you can see down to the south of Makiivka, some fairly substantial gains here for the for the Russians. Sorry, well, I say substantial. There's actually quite a large difference between the two maps here, as you can see in this area to the south of Makiivka from Surat maps to Andriy-Perpetua. That's almost a 3-kilometer difference. That's pretty substantial. The actual gains over the last 24 hours were right along the front lines, but not too deep for the Russians in terms of what Andriy-Perpetua says. And then in this northern part, slightly more substantial in terms of depth for Surat maps. In fact, if we come to look at what Surat maps says of the area, here, situation southwest of Donetsk, the Russian army has advanced between 1 and 1.3 kilometers southwest of Makiivka. They are now located 5 kilometers from that road that we keep talking about. That is really important that the Ukrainians keep control of. Before I go and look at that, let's see what No Report says. Despite significant efforts, the Russians have not managed to gain a foothold in the city or in its close proximity, which allows them to break into Makiivka. However, geolocated footage shows further Russian advances south of the city near the most western ledge. That's this area there, which is sort of in this general area. I think No Reports is just lagging behind some of these other mappers. So actually things have possibly moved on even from there. This is an important road, this one that joins Vuhledar to Konstantinivka and then further on up to Pobieda. And that's what the Russians are trying to move towards to interdict. It's important that the Ukrainians put up some robust defense around Makiivka, which they have, but it might be that again this settlement, rather like Bakhmut, rather like Avdiivka, becomes isolated and surrounded in some kind of cauldron. You can see that sort of building up at the moment. So the Russians, they seem to do this quite regularly. Find these places, try and surround them, and overcome the defenders with mass. But yeah, by the way, New York was hit with aviation, these guided glide bombs. 3 bombs hit New York last 24 hours, so that has been under a lot of pressure. Anyway, when we come further to the west, you can see that there are no changes to the rest of the front line. So that's the Zaporizhia front line, and that is indeed Dnipro River Delta area. No changes there. So I will go. I did tell you that actually, things are potentially quite tough in the Krynky area. It could be time for the Ukrainians to pull out. Don't know if that's going to happen at all. There is talk that the Russians have had time to not only build fortifications as they have in a number of places. The longer it takes to expand bridgeheads, to move, to advance, the longer the Russians have to basically establish themselves. And in this case, in this area, they're doing that by laying wired communications. That then means their communications are impossible to intercept. And that's a real challenge for the Ukrainians. They have, I think, been quite successful in intercepting communications over the length of this war. The Russians have been very bad at communicating secretly or in a secure fashion, This is an attempt for them to redress that balance and to get secure communications in that area. So that is what is happening there. It is challenging for the Ukrainians there. They are taking losses, huge amounts of wounded and perished personnel there. Quite significant numbers in this Krynky area, as you would expect, but they're staying there because the Russians have lost phenomenal amounts, right? And the question is always, is that enough? Like, are the ratios enough to warrant them being there? Because it's very difficult for the Ukrainians to get out. It is a case of kind of shooting fish in a barrel for the Russians to some degree. They know where the Ukrainians are. There's only a very small area that they can exist in here. And it is very difficult for them to get their wounded out. They have to do it every so often back across to Kherson. And it's not like a constant flow of boats that just are like buses, just pick them up, drop them off. There are only certain windows where they can get wounded back to safety here, and that means that there are sometimes wounded sitting there for many days. It is difficult. It is difficult for the Ukrainians, but as I keep saying, as difficult as it is for the Ukrainians, it's pretty harsh to say this, but they are essentially being used in order to extract a cost on the Russians, and as long as that cost is that ratio is to Ukraine's advantage, they'll probably keep the troops there. The question is that still the case? Is this time now to think about moving, or are they still gaining that advantage? Right, let's just pop into this because there's a bit of spare time. Well, I could do a short video, or I could say this. An insightful interview on pressing issues with Vadim Skibitsky, Deputy Chief of Defense Intelligence. A long but engaging thread. So, Russian objectives in 2024. One of the strategic goals of Russia is to capture the whole of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts. So, just to remind you, that is the Donbass, essentially. Part of the Donbass was under the control, that's a purple line, of the Russians since 2014. But in order to get the whole of the Donbass, they need to extend their control of their lines to take the whole of Donetsk Oblast, which is this dotted line just here, going up there. So they would have to take all of this and then all of Luhansk. Now, they only have a little bit more of Luhansk to take, just there and there, in order for them to say, right, tick that one off, we've got Luhansk. In terms of Donetsk, they've got a lot more work to do there, and that would be far more challenging for them. But nonetheless, that is one of their stated goals. Second goal, and we can already see this from the documents that we have at our disposal, is to retain the newly occupied territories, Kherson, Zaporizhia, and part of the Kharkiv region. Another priority is to destroy Ukraine's air defense systems, aviation, and military-industrial complex facilities to prevent the increase in production and strengthening of the capabilities of the Ukrainian armed forces. These are the objectives that Russia has set out for itself this year, so he says, and I think that's broadly going to be accurate. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. Iran is developing military technical cooperation with Russia because Tehran is interested in Russian weapons. Iran hopes to receive modern aviation from Russia, for example, Su-34 training aircraft and radar stations. Negotiations continue. The most active supplies of ammunition from North Korea were carried out during September, October, and November. The main ammunition supplied from the North Koreans is 122mm and 152mm shells. According to our estimates, 1 million such artillery shells were delivered to Russia. HUI's so that's the military intelligence for Ukraine, is conducting information on North Korea and providing ballistic missiles to Russia. The problem is that almost 80% of components, especially electronics, come through the territory of China. In most cases, they are not even made in China, but in other countries. On Russian missile attacks, Russia is focused on destroying Ukraine's military-industrial complex, headquarters, control systems, and individual units that are located on a front line. Definitely true, particularly about the military-industrial complex. The weapons, particularly the Kinzhal, so these hypersonic missiles, the dagger that the Russians use, are very inaccurate and do not achieve the goals that Russia pursues. Interesting claim that. This is, by the way, is a Fulbright scholar at the Bush School of TAMU, former senior advisor of NSC of Georgia. Lots of acronyms there, but he's an expert, right? Doing research. So next, Russian military intelligence likely conducted an analysis of Ukraine's energy facilities in 2022 and 2023. The Russians have identified the most critical objects that can be hit by missiles and unmanned aerial vehicles. Russia continues to regularly take satellite imagery of Ukraine's energy system to carry out missile attacks if possible and if they need it. Therefore, the threat to Ukraine's energy system remains. So there might be primarily going for the military-industrial complex, but they also have the ability to strike Ukraine's energy infrastructure if they get the missiles and have the desire to do so. There is talk about how some of these drones flying over are also doing 3D mapping of Ukraine, and that's a real challenge going forwards. Russia is getting increased and improved intelligence on Ukraine. They've traditionally had very poor intelligence, comparatively speaking, because Ukraine has been able to draw on NATO and the West and really good satellite imagery and whatnot. But if they're flying drones over continuously continually that are also they're basically doing what their satellites can't do, then that puts the Russians possibly in a better situation than they were. The number of working days per week has increased. Some businesses even operate 3 shifts. This does not mean that everything is fine in Russia's defense industry. The main efforts are now focused on restoring equipment that was damaged or destroyed on the battlefield. Another issue is the restoration and preparation for combat use of weapons and military equipment that are removed from long-term storage warehouses, bringing them to normal condition and sending them for combat operations in Ukraine. Something we talked about an awful lot. The third, I talked about this with regard to looking at these lost stats of BMP-1s compared to BMP-2s and BMP-3s. These are the infantry fighting vehicles that the Russians use. The BMP-1s are the oldest ones from the 1950s and 60s and so on. They were the largest sort of proportion of losses historically in terms of BMPs, but now we're seeing more BMP-2s and 3s, and that appears to be because they're taking them out of storage, long-term storage, and they've already polished up the ones that need minimal work and sent them to the front line. A lot of BMP-1s included in there, but now they're having to fully rebuild ones out of long-term storage that take a lot more work. So if you're going to do that, if you've got BMP-1s, 2s and 3s to fix up fundamentally, and no matter which one you choose, it's going to take like a bunch of months to fix that one up. Are you going to do the oldest vehicle, which is crappier, or the newest vehicle that's better? You're going to use the newest. So we're starting to see more BMP-2s and 3s on those lists of lost vehicles, and that reflects that they are fundamentally rebuilding these vehicles rather than just polishing them off, which also means they're more likely to pick the newer vehicles. Yes. So everything that is being currently produced by Russia is immediately sent to the front and used against Ukraine. Therefore, we do not see Moscow significantly increasing the number of weapons and the volume of production of weapons and military equipment. So they're not going to be stockpiling weapons, and they don't have the production capacities to build their army up. They're and it's the same with their personnel, their infantry troops. They are recruiting and sending. They're building and sending, and that appears to be what's going on. Right. Sorry, I did miss this. The third task is the production of new weapons, primarily artillery systems, armoured vehicles, armoured personnel carriers, and infantry fighting vehicles. The fourth mission is the production of ammunition and missiles, but everything they produce is sent to the front line. On Shahed drones, Russia produces around 330 to 350 drones per month. That is very challenging. After the first contract with Russia started producing Shahed drones in Yelabuga. Most of the components come from other countries. Moscow's goal is to reach a closed cycle of production, so they don't need the components shipped from all over the shop. If they can produce that themselves by 2026, then that's beneficial. On mobilization, Putin will not announce mobilization before the elections. Around 1,000 to 1,100 people join the ranks of the Russian armed forces every day. Russians are motivated to join the army due to wages, especially in crisis regions. I'm slightly unsure about this. I know that's what they're claiming. 1,000 a day would be over their loss numbers, so they would be regenerating. That could be true, to be fair, since there are these claims that Russia is poised to attack both, in the south, in the east, and claims about in the northeast as well. Well, they wouldn't be able to do that if they weren't regenerating more than they are losing to some degree. Otherwise, they just wouldn't be able to. So maybe they are managing to recruit 30,000 a month. That will be, considering they're a huge country, they've got a large population. 140 million is nothing to laugh off. Although, the question is how many have left. But also it's the crypto mobilization that they're involved in, sort of stealing people from here and there, even abroad, or forcibly mobilizing people from prisons, so on and so forth. So, they are able to scrabble together numbers that approach or are at 30,000 a month. So that again is a challenge for the Ukrainians. That's I think a fairly decent analysis of where the Russians are at. We shall see whether they are truly able to mount a serious offensive in any of those aforementioned regions. If they do, I just don't think they have the quality personnel or the quality equipment realistically to do that. You saw what happened in Avdiivka, and I'm sure that they won't be able to do it to the same degree as in Avdiivka again. And look at how many vehicles they lost in Avdiivka. The same goes both ways with the prevalence of drones in the air and the munitions that drones can now carry on them, and the larger drones like the Baba Yaga drone for the Ukrainians, they can drop some pretty destructive munitions from there. It is becoming very difficult to do these combined arms maneuvers, while that kind of aerial that contest is still the case in the sky. We're not talking about the context of the contested airspace in terms of airframes like jets and helicopters, but just in terms of drones. It's just so difficult. Either side will be hugely vulnerable to drone strikes, and have been until that is changed. And this is why I think Zelensky was talking about this technological breakthrough. You need to be able to eradicate the opposition's drones, some kind of electronic warfare, even if it takes your own drones out. If you take nothing can fly, some kind of really powerful electronic warfare capability means that nothing can fly in the area. We've spent all the last 6 months degrading your artillery. So that means that without the artillery, and your ATGM crews have been taken down a little bit as well, with our artillery hitting your positions, we can then advance. It might be slowly to get through minefields, but we aren't afraid of the air. So the Ukrainians, as I said before, want to get to this position where they fundamentally degraded the Russian artillery, air defense systems, and equipment in the area, so that they can just stop anything flying in the sky if they possibly can, if that's a capability they're remotely able to do going forward. You want to get to the position where you take the drones out and then you march slowly forward and take the positions, because they don't have the artillery to hit you back. Anyway, thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Check out my live stream from earlier on, where I announced that I'm hoping to go to Ukraine next month. That's really exciting. Quite nervous, I guess, in many ways about that. There are risks involved, but hopefully I can do some good in being out there and communicate to you, what's going on in as accurate a way as I can. Anyway, take care, everybody. Speak soon.